Hello. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Alice Bach, the Helen Ann Professor of Catholic Studies and the Director of the Helen Ann Project. Let me remind you before I say anything else, there is no eating or drinking in this auditorium. Oh, yeah, no smoking, no weed, no nothing, but basically, it's what they really care about is no drinking and no food. I'm delighted to welcome you today to the Helen Ann Project for Peace and Social Justice final lecture of 2008. First of all, I want to thank a few people without whom the Helen Ann Project would be even more rickety when we try to bring together people of different viewpoints than it is. One person who is truly amazing is Bassam Kawam. Hey, babe. Who manages to bring people together who don't even know they might have things in common until after Bassam has brought them all together and said, give it a try, go ahead, do it. He is an outstanding person and knows more about networking than AT&T. Then I would also like to thank my Associate Director, Rebecca Mason, without whom Rebecca is going to Ramallah, inshallah, around the middle of January, and she is, we're very proud of her that she will be on the ground aiding in the work, but we also eagerly await and pray for her safe return. She will be writing to us, and we will spread the word about what she is finding in Ramallah and the refugee camps around Ramallah. Today is an auspicious day for this lecture that ends the events, to end our series of events concerning the Israel-Palestine conflict and the occupation of Palestine, which has lasted for more than 40 years. As our final speaker, we have invited Norman Finkelstein, known for his passionate defense of Palestinian rights. And today happens to be the 60th anniversary of the United Nations General Assembly passage of Resolution 194, which officially recognizes the right of return for the Palestinian refugees who were expelled and dispossessed of their homes and their land during al-Nakba, the catastrophe, the name given by the Palestinians to the systematic expulsion of their people during the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. For many years, Norman Finkelstein has been a vocal critic of Israeli policies concerning the treatment of Palestinians. His earliest major writing was the international bestseller, The Holocaust Industry, in which he wrote of an iconoclastic interrogation of the new anti-Semitism. In 2007, Raoul Hilberg, most distinguished historian on the Nazi Holocaust and member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences until his death in late 2007, in August, I believe, said in reflection on Professor Finkelstein's seminal work, when he published this book, he was alone. It takes an enormous amount of academic courage to speak the truth when no one else is out there to support him. And so I think that given this acuity of vision and analytical power, I would say that his place in the entire history of writing history is assured. And that those who, in the end, are proven right, triumph. And he will be among those who will have triumphed, albeit, so it seems, at great cost. In his work, Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict, Finkelstein critically engages the earlier influential studies of Joan Peters, Benny Morris, and Anita Shapira. In this work, Finkelstein proves himself to be one of the most radical and hard-hitting critics of the official Zionist version of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the historians who support and uphold that version. As my students can all tell you, The introduction to the second edition of Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine conflict provides the most succinct overview available. If you read this introduction about 6 times before the final exam, you will succeed with flying colors. Finally, and perhaps most important for our understanding of the occupation of Palestine and Gaza today, Finkelstein compares, at the end of the new edition of this book, Israeli policy in the occupied territories against South African apartheid. It is not easy being Norman Finkelstein. He was denied tenure at DePaul University because of a vicious campaign set up by those who were afraid of his words and his speaking truth to power. In May 2008, Dr. Finkelstein was detained when he arrived at Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv and interrogated by the Shin Bet for 24 hours, deported and banned from entering Israel for 10 years. And this is what Dr. Finkelstein said to an Israeli newspaper following his deportation to Amsterdam. I have always supported a 2-state solution based on the 1967 borders. I am not an enemy of Israel. I did my best to provide absolutely candid and comprehensive answers to all the questions put to me. Dr. Finkelstein has just completed a new book entitled A Farewell to Israel, The Coming Breakup of American Zionism, which will be published next year, 2009. There's another book of Dr. Finkelstein's that I would like to point out to you, a lesser-known book published by the University of Minnesota in 1996. And I'd like to single it out because it is an amazing connection of it's a personal experience, historical data, and political analysis. Very hard to coalesce all of those things. Finkelstein's parents were survivors of the Nazi death camps, and in this book he focuses on the daily lives of the Palestinians, to whom he had become very close during his time spent in the Middle East. And he focuses upon 2 very different Palestinian families, one from the Christian Palestinian village of Beit Saor, outside of Bethlehem, the other from the Fawar refugee camp outside of Hebron. And throughout this book, for those who have been to those areas and those who have not yet seen them, Finkelstein provides unique insight into the names and the faces beyond the conflict and the human toll of that so-called negotiated peace. And since we don't hear very much in the United States about the people's lives, even though this book is 12 years old, it will open a lot of doors to you in hearing the words from the souls of the people who live under occupation. Norman Finkelstein received his doctorate in 1988 from the Department of Politics at Princeton University. For many years, he has taught political theory in the Israel-Palestine conflict. He's currently an independent scholar who lives in Brooklyn, New York. He is a tireless crusader activist for the rights of Palestinians and Israelis in the land that stretches from the Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea, a land that may be divided politically, but cannot be divided physically. I am proud and honored to introduce Dr. Norman Finkelstein.
We have to wait 3 minutes, 3 seconds. Can you hear me in the back? Raise your hand if you hear me. Okay, we're set. Well, I'm not using this microphone. I'm using the the portable one. Okay. I think actually that might be too loud. No? Okay. Well, Thank you for inviting me, and that was a very generous introduction. I would almost feel sorry for the person who's described, but alas, it's me, and it's not been a bad life. In fact, I think it's been a wonderful life. I have no complaints that I can think of at any rate. It happens that yesterday is the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I thought that that should be the theme for this evening's talk. The main human rights challenge now facing the Palestinians is in the Gaza Strip, and so I'll, at least at the beginning of my remarks, focus on what's going on there. Most of you know that about 1.5 million Palestinians have been under a relentless and brutal siege for a quite long time now. It's hard to date exactly when the siege began, but certainly in the last couple of years, it's escalated significantly, and the deprivations have been significantly exacerbated. The head of the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is the main United Nations agency working in the refugee camps, marked the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration with a statement which was reprinted in the British Guardian, and I'll just briefly excerpt it. Her name is Karen Abu Zayed, and she wrote, "As we approach the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the steadily rising death toll in Gaza highlights the painful gap between its, meaning the Declaration's, peaceful rhetoric and the desperate reality for the Palestinian people." And then she goes on to quote what distinguished human rights personalities have had to say about what's going on now in Gaza. So she says, "The former High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, has said that in Gaza, nothing short of a civilization is being destroyed." Desmond Tutu, the South African Nobel laureate for peace, has called what's going on in Gaza an abomination. The humanitarian coordinator for the occupied Palestinian territory, Maxwell Gaylord, said that in Gaza there was a massive assault on human rights. And most recently, the European Commissioner, Louis Michel, described the blockade of Gaza as a form of collective punishment against Palestinian civilians, which is a violation of international humanitarian law. And then she goes on to look at the most salient aspect, the most outstanding aspect of the human rights violations, namely the casualty figures. Fatality figures for the occupied Palestinian territory must surely make us question our commitment to upholding the right to life, the most basic of human rights. More than 500 Palestinians, 73 of them children, have been killed this year alone as a result of the conflict. 11 Israelis have lost their lives this year. So the kill ratio this year is about 50 to 1, 50 Palestinians killed for each Israeli killed. To my knowledge, I think one Israeli child has been injured, none killed. I could be mistaken, but I think it's one has only been injured, not killed. 73 Palestinian children have been killed the past year. Well, those are the raw figures, and some may say, yes, what's happening there is awful, what's happening there is an abomination, but isn't it true that Hamas, the Islamic movement, is responsible, the cause of the violence? It's a little difficult now to go through the whole record of cause and effect in the Gaza and its relations with Israel, but we do have, at least for the most recent period, a statement by the Special Rapporteur, the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, namely the statement by Richard Falk, which he issued 2 days ago on December 9th. And he refers specifically to the most recent turn of events, and he says as follows: "It should be noted that the situation worsened in recent days due to the breakdown of a truce between Hamas and Israel that had been observed for several months by both sides. The truce was maintained by Hamas despite the failure of Israel to fulfill its obligation under the agreement to improve the living conditions of the people of Gaza. The recent upsurge of violence occurred after an Israeli incursion. Incidentally, the incursion occurred purposely on November 4th, Election Day, on the assumption that people's attentions would be riveted elsewhere in the US. The recent upsurge of violence occurred after an Israeli incursion that killed several alleged Palestinian militants within Gaza." That's been the picture for the past couple of years. Again, time doesn't allow me to look at cause and effect, but each time Hamas has introduced or agreed to a truce, at some point Israel has attempted to sabotage the truce and to instigate Hamas into retaliating. Now, a reasonable question obviously would be, why does Israel do that? Why is it so dead intent on sabotaging these truces, these temporary truces, if one would assume they're interested in peace and they're interested in preventing rocket attacks on their southern cities of Sderot and elsewhere? And in fact, just in the past couple of days, this is actually yesterday, the foreign minister of Israel, Tzipi Livni, she gave a very clear explanation of why they do what they do, why they keep sabotaging these truces, and why they keep trying to instigate Hamas into retaliating. She said that when Israel accepted the truce, it wanted to create a temporary period of calm. And she added that an extended truce or long-term calm, harms this Israeli strategic goal, empowers Hamas, and gives the impression that Israel recognizes the movement. And that is, in fact, an accurate statement of the problem for Israel. Israel is worried. Israel only wants a temporary truce. It does not want an extended truce because it's fearful that it may in some way legitimize Hamas. That is to say, people will begin to say, international pressure will begin to build, and people will say, well, it seems that Hamas can be trusted. You can negotiate a truce with them. They keep to the truce, and therefore we have what seems to be the basic precondition for negotiations. And that's exactly what Israel fears, that pressure will be brought to bear on it to negotiate a settlement. It's what Israeli political scientist, he's since passed away, his name is Avner Yaniv, he called the threat of the Palestinian peace offensives. That's his expression. The fear that the Palestinians were becoming too moderate, too reasonable, and therefore Israel will not have a pretext or an alibi, an excuse for not negotiating with them. So you have to keep instigating violence in order to show to the international community that these people can't be negotiated with and you can't reach a settlement with them. The main problem for Israel, as it's been for probably now 3 or more decades, the main problem for Israel has been the Palestinians have been too reasonable, they've been too moderate, they've been too willing to negotiate a settlement. Now, that's not a rhetorical device on my part. It's not simply a propagandistic declaration. There's an ample documentary record to support this statement. In fact, the record is remarkably unambiguous. The record is remarkably uncontroversial. And it's that record which I would like to look at right now. It's the foundation of that dreaded Palestinian peace offensive, which, as the foreign minister put, always conflicts with Israel's strategic goal. Well, what does the record look like? Since we began with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was ratified on December 10th by the United Nations General Assembly, the obvious place to begin in examining the record, the obvious place to begin is the United Nations General Assembly. And as it happens, the UN General Assembly each year votes on a resolution entitled Peaceful Settlement of the Question of Palestine. And coincidentally, that resolution was just deliberated on and voted on about a week ago. It's every year, November 29th. And I checked the resolution for this year. Each year, the text is roughly the same. It's a long resolution now because it's been added onto over a period of 20 years, but the essence is fairly straightforward. I'll read you the crucial excerpts. Affirming the principle of the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. Reaffirming the illegality of the Israeli settlements in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem. Reiterating its, meaning the UN's demand, for the complete cessation of all Israeli settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory. Reaffirming its commitment, in accordance with international law, to the two-state solution of Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security within recognized borders based on the pre-June 1967 borders. The withdrawal of Israel from the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, and finally, the need for justly resolving the problem of the Palestinian refugees in conformity with its Resolution 194 of, as Professor Bach said, 11 December 1948, namely 60 years today. That's the resolution, and each year, naturally, there is a vote on it. The vote this past year was 164 to 7 with 3 abstentions. The whole world on one side, 164 countries, and on the other side voting against, Israel, the United States, Australia, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Nauru, and Palau. For those of you who don't know Nauru and Palau, they're South Sea atolls. Their combined populations can fill the empty seats in this room, and there would still be room left over. Actually, if we add on the populations of Micronesia and Marshall Islands, we'd still have a few seats left over. So it's basically the United States and Israel. The vote this year is representative of the vote for the past 20 years. Time doesn't allow me to go through all the votes. I'll go back as far as 1989, the same basic resolution, as everyone in this room knows, calling for a two-state settlement on the June 1967 border, a full Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and a just resolution of the refugee question based on the right of return and compensation. If you take 1989, the vote was 153 to 2, 153 3 to 3. 155 to 3, excuse me. It was the whole world on one side, and the other side was the United States, Israel, and the island state of Dominica. If you move up to more recent years, the vote in 1997 was 155 to 2, 2002, 160 to 4, 2003, 160 to 6, 2004, 161 to 7, 2007, 161 to 7, and as I said earlier, this year the vote was 164 to 7. Obviously, these are not very close votes. In fact, they're remarkable in the consensus they draw on, and they're remarkable in how lopsided and how overwhelming they were. Well, some people may wish to make the argument that it's the General Assembly, it's a political body, and therefore, almost by definition, the votes are politicized. There's an argument, obviously, that can be made on those grounds, but in my opinion, at any rate, it's not a particularly credible argument because these are votes that have been consistent over a sustained period of time, and they're also overwhelming. Regardless of which governments have been in power in the various states that have voted on this resolution, whether it's a left-wing government, a right-wing government, or a centrist government, regardless of the governments that have been in power, the vote has been very consistent. And it's been consistent for a fairly obvious reason, namely the principles that form the basis of this resolution are remarkably uncontroversial under international law. They're grounded in tenets of international law and or grounded in the United Nations Charter. And that brings me to the second venue. As I said, some people would want to make the argument that we can't trust the General Assembly because it's a politicized body. Well, then the next obvious place to look, instead of looking at the most representative political body in the world, let's turn to the most respected body in the world, namely the International Court of Justice, the supreme legal body in the world today. And as it happens, in 2004, the International Court of Justice was asked by the General Assembly to render what's called in the technical literature an advisory opinion on the wall that Israel has been building in the West Bank. And in order for the International Court to render an advisory opinion on the legality of the wall, as it happened, it had to first render an authoritative opinion on the fundamental legal questions bearing on the Israel-Palestine question, namely those issues which we're told are so controversial, so intricate, so complex, that they have to be deferred to the final stages of negotiations. So most of you have heard of this phenomenon called the peace process. And then a subdivision of this peace process is this thing called the final status issues. How many people have heard of the final status issues? Who here is clever enough that he or she can name all four? Now, yesterday I was at Sarah Lawrence and there was a clever young man who named 3. So you have your challenge for you. Who can name 4? Technically there are 5, but one has sort of cast aside. Who can name the 4? Anyone? There must be somebody courageous enough to make a fool of him or herself, to humiliate and embarrass him or herself, to demean and degrade. Okay, go ahead.
I would say refugees, East Jerusalem. I had in mind the settlements, right? Thank you. And I was thinking the final resolution of the minor border adjustment.
Very good. That was a good showing. Let it not be said that students at Case Western are complete imbeciles. No, that was very good. The four main final status issues are borders, settlements, Jerusalem, and the refugees. It used to be the fifth main issue was water, but water has now been pretty much subsumed under the question of borders. And those are the issues which we're told are so complicated that we can't even begin to discuss them until there are what's sometimes called in this lexicon confidence-building measures between both sides. Well, the International Court of Justice, the highest judicial body in the world, it had to address 3 of 4 of those final status issues. Why? Well, first of all, Israel is building this wall well inside the West Bank. It will ultimately appropriate about 12% of the West Bank. And so the question obviously arises, to whom does the West Bank belong? If it were true that the West Bank were disputed territory, were it true, then obviously the legal status of the wall would also be disputed. Similarly, the wall takes this circuitous route, or as the International Court of Justice put it, the wall takes a sinuous route, that means a winding route like a snake, takes a sinuous route that incorporates about 60% of the settlements and 80% of the settlers. Now, were it true that the legal status of the settlements were disputed, then once again, obviously, the legal status of the wall would be open to dispute. And finally, the wall cuts right through East Jerusalem, basically in such a way as to put the Arabs on one side and Jerusalem on the other side. And the question again arises, what's the legal status of Jerusalem? Were it true that Jerusalem was disputed territory, then again the legal status of the wall would be open to dispute. And so before the court was able to render its opinion on the legal status of the wall, it had to render an opinion on all these final status issues. What did it find? Number one, the International Court of Justice stated, under international law, in particular Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, it's inadmissible for countries to acquire territory by war. Israel acquired the West Bank and Gaza in the course of the June 1967 war. Ergo, it has no legal title to the West Bank and Gaza. Those are, and the International Court is very clear, those are occupied Palestinian territories. Uppercase O, uppercase P, uppercase T. And you'll find in many human rights reports now they refer to OPT, occupied Palestinian territories, using the nomenclature of the International Court. Israel has no legal title to 1 part of 1 inch of the West Bank or Gaza. Those are not disputed territories, says the highest judicial body in the world. Those are occupied Palestinian territories. Number 2, the question of Jerusalem. Well, how did Israel acquire East Jerusalem? It acquired East Jerusalem in the course of the June 1967 war. But under international law, it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Ergo, Israel has no title whatsoever to any of East Jerusalem. It's occupied Palestinian territory. The court is very emphatic on that point. It refers to the West Bank, comma, including East Jerusalem, comma, and the Gaza as occupied Palestinian territory, so as not to leave any ambiguity about the legal status of East Jerusalem. Number 3, what's the legal status of the settlers and the settlements in the occupied territories? The 480,000 Jewish settlers now inhabiting the occupied Palestinian territory or residing in the occupied Palestinian territory. Again, the court is very clear. Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention states it's inadmissible for an occupying power to transfer its population to occupied territory. Therefore, under international law, all 480,000 settlers are illegally residing in occupied Palestinian territory. That's only half the story, however. The other half of the story is what the vote was. Now remember, bear in mind, we're told these are controversial issues. We're told these are complicated issues. We're told that they're so controversial and so complicated that they have to be deferred to the last stage of negotiations. You would think, one would infer, that the vote would be close. But the vote was 14-1. It was not a close vote. It wasn't a close vote for a simple reason, because the issues on which they were deliberating are the most fundamental principles of international law: the inadmissibility of acquiring territory by war, the illegality of settling your population in occupied territory. The vote was 14-1. The one negative vote was cast by the American judge, Thomas Bergenthal, but even Judge Bergenthal was very careful in how he qualified his negative vote. In the nomenclature of the International Court of Justice, you can deliver a dissent, a declaration, you can join the majority, or you can agree with the majority and write a separate opinion. Judge Bergenthal chose not to write a dissent. He instead chose to write what he called a declaration. And in his declaration, he began by saying, I agree with much in the majority opinion. And then he concluded his declaration by stating, on the fundamental question, namely the question of the settlements, Judge Bergenthal said, I agree with the majority. There can't be any question but that under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, the settlements are illegal under international law. And so what do you find? On these allegedly complicated questions, the vote is 14-1 on all the issues, and on the core issue, namely the question of those settlements, the vote is 15-0. Now, it's very difficult to make an argument that the court also is stacked against Israel. The British judge, Rosalind Higgins, she's Jewish by birth. She married an Irishman. And her legal articles on the conflict tend to be quite pro-Israel. In fact, I think she goes over the line. But she voted with the majority. Why did she vote with the majority? Because these are not complicated questions under international law. Thomas Bergenthal, he's a Nazi Holocaust survivor. He's the real McCoy. But on the fundamental question of the settlements, he had to vote with the majority. All this talk we hear in the United States about these being complicated questions, controversial, the West Bank being disputed territory, Jerusalem being Israel's eternal and undivided capital, have no bearing whatsoever on the actual documentary record, the political record, as registered in the General Assembly, and the legal record as registered in the International Court of Justice. Now, it's true that the International Court didn't rule on the refugee question for the simple reason that it had no bearing on the question of the wall. But here we have organizations of equal stature which have registered opinions. So if I were to ask somebody in the audience arbitrarily, if I were to ask you, what's the most respected human rights organization in the world, you would respond? Well, I'm talking about a global organization. The most respected human rights organization in the world is? Yeah, most people would say Amnesty International, and then after Amnesty, most people would say Human Rights Watch. Yeah, those are the two most respected. I didn't plant those answers in the audience. Most people would, I think, familiar with the field, would cite them immediately. And it happens that both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, the two most respected and very far from radical, in fact, Human Rights Watch, you can say, is quite conservative, the two most respected human rights organizations in the world did render judgments on the question of, or did render position papers on the question of the refugees. So in 2001, Human Rights Watch stated, "We urge Israel to recognize the right to return for those Palestinians and their descendants who fled from territory that is now within the state of Israel and who have maintained appropriate links with that territory." Then Amnesty International, a few months later, issued its own statement, which read, "We call for Palestinians who fled or were expelled from Israel, the West Bank, or Gaza Strip, along with those of their descendants who have maintained genuine links with the area, to be able to exercise their right to return." As you can see, even though these are separate organizations, autonomous organizations, and very independent organizations, the language is almost identical. Both contain the phrase "right to return," and the reason the language is almost identical, the reason why both use the language "right to return," is once again because these are basic principles of international law, as it happens, first enunciated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. By coincidence, the Declaration was passed on December 10th, and the first practical application of the Universal Declaration was that UN Resolution 194, namely the resolution in December 11, 1948, ratifying the Palestinian right to return. It's not something that dropped from the sky. They were simply reiterating the principle which was first inscribed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Well, that's a survey of the global organizations. Some of you say, well, but what about those Arab organizations? Just as a mention before I get to them, I mentioned to you earlier that the vote this year in the UN General Assembly was 164-7 in favor of that two-state settlement, June 67 border, and so forth. I have the list here. If there were an overhead projector, I would show it. Among the countries which signed on were Iran and Iraq. The perfidious Iranians, the anti-Semites who want to commit a Holocaust, when it came to the General Assembly vote, they joined the whole of humankind, apart from the United States, Israel, Nauru, Palau, and so forth. What about the more local initiatives? Well, there is an Arab League, and in March 2002, the Arab League put forth a two-state settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict, exactly the same terms as the General Assembly, except, remarkably enough, the Arab League went one step beyond the the General Assembly. Because under international law, you're formally required to recognize under Article 2 the right of any member state to live free from threats or use of force. That's the statement. But the Arab League went further. It said if Israel agrees to these terms for resolving the conflict, we will not only recognize Israel, the Arab League said, we will normalize relations with Israel. We'll have economic relations with Israel, we'll have trade relations with Israel, we'll have tourism relations with Israel. They went beyond the international consensus, beyond what they're legally bound to do under international law. What was the vote in the Arab League? Once again, the vote was unanimous. Every member of the Arab League voted for the two-state settlement on the June 67 border and the just resolution of the refugee question. The Arab League then kept reiterating its offer up to and including last year, 2008. Well, that then just leaves the main protagonists in the conflict, apart from Israel, whose position has been clearly stated, namely rejecting all these terms for resolving the conflict. The Palestinian Authority has been on record supporting the two-state settlement now since the mid-1970s, and in more recent years, you can say in the last year or last year and a half, Hamas as well has come on board. And of course, this is a disaster for Israel. It's that dreaded Palestinian peace offensive. With Hamas now on board, how do you explain your refusal to settle the conflict? And so whenever Hamas appears to becoming too legitimate, and whenever it appears as if the pressure is going to build on Israel to finally resolve the conflict in terms of international law, in terms of the opinion of enlightened humankind, Israel does what it can to break the truces, to instigate violence, and to create a new pretext and excuse to avoid a negotiated and diplomatic settlement of the conflict. In my view, our main challenge now, the main challenge is to make known, to publicize what the actual record shows, because so many people are so completely ignorant of or confused by the record. People recognize there's a problem there, and they recognize, many do, that Israel is committing significant human rights violations and crimes in the occupied territories. But there still remains this perception that the conflict is unresolvable. And it's unresolvable either because of Palestinian terrorism, because of a clash of civilizations, because of a clash of religions, because of ancient enmities, and so forth. But in fact, the only reason the conflict is unresolvable, it's because the United States and Israel refuse to resolve the conflict. That's the obstacle. And our job is to show the conflict is resolvable, and what the Palestinians are asking, it's not the stars, the moon, and the sky. They're asking for their minimum, basic, uncontroversial rights under international law, which have been repeatedly certified in all the main political and legal and human rights bodies in the world. And here I have to say, at any rate, in my own opinion, we have been those who are trying to achieve a just and lasting peace. We've been severely delinquent in our responsibilities, and there's a lot that we can learn from the history of the Zionist movement, because the Zionist movement understood that in order to achieve its goal, you have to win over public opinion. You have to reach the people. And the way you win over public opinion, the way you reach the people, is by holding up high your certificates of legitimacy. You show public opinion that what you're requesting, what you want, what you desire, what you aspire to is legitimate. And that's what the Zionist movement did. So, 90 years ago, this obscure foreign minister of England named Arthur Balfour issued a declaration. It was one sentence, wasn't a short sentence. There were many subclauses, but nonetheless, it was one sentence. But if I were to ask the people in this room, how many of you have heard of the Balfour Declaration? Raise your hand. And if you look around, we could say nearly 100%, which is an impressive showing. In 1947, the United Nations General Assembly issued in November 47 its famous partition resolution allowing for the creation of an Arab and a Jewish state in Palestine. And if I were to ask you, how many of you in this room have heard of the partition resolution? How many hands would go up? Let's see. Basically the same, nearly 100%. Now you might ask yourself, how did that come to pass? A one-sentence statement by an obscure foreign minister nearly a century ago, and the middle of Cleveland, Ohio, nearly 100% of the people have heard of it? Or a General Assembly resolution, one of thousands, and in the middle of Ohio, 60 years later, nearly everyone in the room has heard of it? Well, the reason you've heard of it is because the Zionist movement did its homework, and it did its footwork. It made sure you heard of it, because exactly as Abba Eban said, Israel's most famous foreign minister, he said that, referring to the partition resolution, he said it was Israel's birth certificate. And he was exactly right, because the partition resolution ascertained that the state of Israel is not a bastard child, it's the legitimate offspring of the international community. It was a certificate of legitimacy. It said to the world, what we want, we are legitimately entitled to. How do we know? Because the birth certificate was issued by the highest political body in the world, the United Nations General Assembly. That's the way to win over public opinion. But then now let's look at our side. This is a reasonably informed audience. If I were to ask you, how many of you know that every year, for the past 20 years and more, the United Nations General Assembly issues yet another birth certificate for the state of Palestine? How many of you know that? Look around the room. It's not an impressive showing. If I were to ask you, how many of you know that in 2004, the International Court of Justice issued an opinion in which all of Israel's official positions were resoundingly rejected? How many of you know that? Look around the room. That's what?
One of your speeches is on the internet. That's how I heard it.
That's the problem. That, I think, is the problem. In fact, the partition resolution, as some of you know, just barely passed in 1947. 33, 13, 10, 33, 4, 13 against, 10 abstentions. And they got to 33 votes, basically the Zionist movement through bribes and arm twisting. The General Assembly vote the past 20 years has not been a bare 2/3. It's been the whole world. The body is much more representative. In 47, it was 60 countries. Now the UN General Assembly is 192. It's a much more representative body, and the vote is not close. it's overwhelming. And anyone has to agree that a ruling by the International Court of Justice carries a lot more moral and legal weight than a statement by the Foreign Minister of England at the turn of the century in 1917. So the certificates of legitimacy for the Palestinian rights to self-determination and statehood are much greater than the certificates of legitimacy of the Zionist movement. But nobody knows. That, I think, is the main problem. And I want to just leave off, because the time is limited, to addressing several other questions. Briefly, I spoke this afternoon with Professor Bach and several others, and they gave me some sense of the issues I should be addressing. So I want to just briefly go through them quickly. In my view, it's not possible to win this case, which happens to be a very strong case. In fact, it's an uncontroversial case. But you can't win the case if you try to defy international public opinion, if you try to defy the political opinion as registered in the General Assembly, if you try to defy the opinion of the International Court of Justice. That is to say, these occasional calls for eliminating the Zionist entity or embracing a one-state solution, which has exactly zero support in the international community, those kinds of slogans, those kinds of demands, they can't possibly succeed in achieving a just and lasting peace within our lifetime. Now, some of you may say, well, that's the problem. The problem is the international community has fallen behind the times, that we have to now aim towards, strive towards, aspire to a one-state settlement. In my view, if you look at the record, it's very difficult to change international public opinion. It's a very slow and long march. All of international law, as the lawyers in this room will know, it's always built on precedent. You have to find some antecedent to rest your case on. And so, for example, in November 1988, when the then chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, when he declared a state in Algiers in November '88, he was very careful in making his declaration or founding it on the partition resolution. He said the partition resolution called for two states. Where is the Palestinian state? He looked for a precedent. And the same thing if you're following the latest remarks by the current General Assembly President, Descoto Brachman from Nicaragua. Yes, he's been very aggressive in his denunciations of Israeli policy, but he's always very careful to couch his denunciations in precedent, saying the 1947 resolution called for two states, and we have some unfinished business here. There's one state that's yet to be born. And so if you want to argue for one state, you have to be honest enough to tell the Palestinians who are languishing under a brutal and inhuman occupation that probably for this and several more generations, they will have to continue to endure that occupation, because it's at least several generations that will be required before we can change international public opinion and change the consensus for resolving the conflict. And I'll leave you my own view, how to press ahead. I was recently, beginning in August of this year, I began reading in a fairly conscientious way Gandhi. He's an interesting fellow. As human beings go, he's very inspiring, very decent, when Gandhi went to speak, he did not charge $40,000 speaking fees. Gandhi was very careful about the people's money. I mean, so careful that it would be breathtaking for anyone who reads him. I was reading the other day, I'm going through his collected works now, which is a chore, it's 100 volumes. And somebody asks him to purchase a watch, W-A-T-C-H. And Gandhi replies, "Why do you need a watch? It's obvious when it's morning, it's obvious when it's afternoon, and it's obvious when it's night. What more do you need?" Not sure how good he was about keeping appointments, but... And he also could be kind of cruel, I have to say. I know it's a strange thing to say about the Mahatma, but in his later years, I think he got a little bit crabby. Somebody would write a letter to him saying, "Mahatma, my daughter just got married. We're going to have a wedding." And he replies, "Weddings, life, death, it's all the same." Yes, and then somebody wrote, "My son died." And he said, "Well, birth, death, it's the cycle." I don't know. As young people used to say, that's very cold. But he's very inspiring to read. And his movement to try to free first the Indians in South Africa from their bondage, and then to free the Indians from the British occupation, he called his movement Satyagraha. And I always liked the translation. There was a whole debate about what to call it, and Gandhi never liked the term passive civil disobedience because he thought what he was involved in was very active. It wasn't passive at all. And so he rejected that term. And finally, somebody recommended he call it Satyagraha. And Satyagraha is translated as hold on to the truth. And I think if I were to choose a motto for the movement we're involved in, and also for decent movements generally, I think the principle should be Satyagraha, hold on to the truth. And that's our challenge, to hold on to the truth that what Israel has done to the Palestinians is wrong, to hold on to the truth that Israel's refusal, backed by the US, to respect international law and the considered opinion of humankind is the sole obstacle, the one and only obstacle to ending the suffering of the Palestinian people. And as we hold on to the truth, I think we should also try to bear in mind the wisdom of the African American spiritual, the one that says to keep our eyes on the prize and hold on. Keep our eyes on the prize and hold on. And what does that mean? How many people know that spiritual? There's some older people in here. Good. I think it's a great song. Unfortunately, one of the people who sang it best just passed away last week, Odetta. How many people have heard her sing it? Yeah, she was good. She was very good, and I think she may have been one of the first persons I heard sing it. What was it originally before Keep Your Eyes on the Prize? Who knows?
Keep your hand on the plow.
Keep your hand on the plow, yeah. But it changed to Keep Your Eyes on the Prize. And anyone have a good enough voice for those young people who haven't heard it? Good, let's hear.
Eyes on the prize or hand on the plow?
Keep your eye, just the chorus. Keep your, go ahead.
Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on.
You have a great voice. I regret not being on the picket line with her. But I'll tell you something, you wouldn't regret not being on the picket line with me if you heard how I sang it. That was beautiful. Keep your eyes on the prize. And we should remember what the prize is. The prize is not a theoretical fad. It's not to be intellectually provocative. It's not holier than thou radical posturing. The prize is much more humdrum, prosaic by comparison. The prize is freeing the Palestinian people from their bondage. Keep your eyes on the prize. Remember what it's about. And then to hold on. And hold on means being ready for sacrifice and for the long haul. Keep your eyes on the prize and hold on. A little sacrifice, a long battle. We should always bear in mind, for almost everyone in this audience, unless you're a member of a targeted minority, we live in a very free society. We're pretty much able to say what we want. The consequences are trivial as compared to elsewhere in the world. I wasn't happy when I was denied tenure, and I have my bouts of self-pity, and that's why I have friends to chew their ears off. But a moment's objectivity, I have a very good friend who's one of the greatest people in the world. Most of you won't know him because he's not here anymore. He's elsewhere in the world. Alan Nairn. He was a great investigative reporter on Guatemala, on East Timor, and elsewhere. And during my tenure battle, he was a source of both solace and, more importantly, guidance. And he said to me at some point, you know, Norman, let's be honest. It's small change what happened to you. And that's true. We have to be honest about those things. In most parts of the world today, you advocate for your most basic elementary rights. You don't lose a job, you lose a body part. You lose a limb. You lose your nose, you lose your tongue, you lose your ears, you lose your eyes. That's what it's mostly like in the world. You also lose your head in many parts of the world, and you lose your life. So we're not talking about big sacrifices. And hopefully, possibly, the haul won't be that long either. Keep your eyes on the prize and hold on. And then always to remember the Caribbean poet, a fellow named Aimé Césaire. He had a very nice line. It was poetic, but meaningful at the same time. He said, "There's room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory." There's room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory. And the late Edward Said, in the last years of his life, he liked to quote that line, and we should also bear it in mind. We want to nurture a movement and not to create a cult. The victory to which we aspire is inclusive. It's not exclusive. It is not at anyone's expense, not at the expense of Palestinians and not at the expense of Israelis. It's to be victorious without vanquishing. No one is a loser. No one is a loser, and we are all gainers if together we stand by truth and justice. If you stand by truth and justice, if anyone does, you don't lose. We all gain. I am not anti-English, said Gandhi. I am not anti-British. I am not anti any government. But, he said, I am anti-untruth. I am anti-humbug. And I am anti-injustice. And I think we should say the same thing. We're obviously not anti-Jewish. We shouldn't be anti-Israel. And in my opinion, we shouldn't be anti-Zionist either. The prize on which our eyes should be riveted is human rights, human dignity, and human equality. We should not be asking questions like, are you now or have you ever been a Zionist? Those are meaningless questions, in my opinion. Instead, we should be asking, are you for or against ethnic cleansing? Are you for or against torture? Are you for or against house demolitions? Are you for or against Jews-only roads and Jews-only settlements? Are you for or against discriminatory laws? And if the answer comes against, and against, shouldn't we then say, keep your ideology, whatever it might be. There's room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory. And may we all, seekers of truth, fighters for justice, yet live to join the people of Palestine, the God-forsaken people of Palestine, at the rendezvous of victory. Thank you. Well, now comes the time when I get to engage with the people of not Palestine, but the people of Cleveland. So I usually enter one caveat, and the caveat is, since people, as always, were very respectful of my person, didn't jeer, and I allow for jeering actually, but weren't distracting, I prefer that the first questioners should be dissenters, those who sharply disagree, but were respectful of me, endured what I had to say, and now those who wish to dissent should have at least the first 2 or 3 questions, and then it's opened up for everyone.
Mic on? Let me just say, first of all, we are very grateful to you. Wonderful evening. Anybody is welcome to ask a question. Keep your questions short, respectful, and civil. That's all we ask. And since Professor Finkelstein has asked for people who have questions that are from other viewpoints, is that
Well, I
right?
would prefer those who were respectful but found it difficult to digest what I had to say, they should be allowed to go first.
We prefer if you come up and speak into the mic, please.
Mr. Finkelstein, I'd like to ask you a question about something that you have said in a past lecture. You say in May 8th, 2005 lecture at the University of Illinois that Alan Dershowitz's book, The Case for Israel, is sheer, unadulterated, from the first uppercase letter to the last period, a complete fraud. However, the New York Times said about the same book that Dershowitz knows how to construct an argument, especially effective at pointing out the hypocrisy of many of Israel's critics. This book is also praised by the Washington Post, London Times, Jerusalem Post, and Haaretz. Can you please explain how you and the Times came to such different conclusions about the same book?
Well, that's a perfectly reasonable question. And here I would say that each person has to use his or her own judgment, his or her own reasoning faculty. I reached my conclusion after reading the book carefully several times. I probably read it more times than Professor Dershowitz read it. And I examined the sources, checked his citations, and I reached the conclusion the book was a complete fraud. And I said as much when I publicly debated him on Democracy Now! I agree with you, or what would be implicit in your question, had I limited myself to simply declaring the book a fraud or a fake from the first uppercase letter to the last period, had I limited myself to that, you would have probably excellent grounds for questioning my judgment. But I recognized that a responsible person cannot limit him or herself to simply an ad hominem attack or an epithet. You have a responsibility to document it. On Democracy Now! I debated him for approximately 2 hours, and I tried to cite some of the documentation. You can watch the program and decide for yourself how effective he was in rebutting my claims. But then I went one step further, which is I sat down and I wrote a book approximately 320 pages in length, in which I literally went through each and every one of his claims. Literally. I know it sounds boring and it sounds tedious. And what I did was I juxtaposed his claims not against what Professor Finkelstein says, not against what the Palestinian Authority says, not against what the Arab League says. I simply took each and every one of his claims and juxtaposed it against what mainstream human rights organizations have to say. Most importantly, the Israeli human rights organizations. So I quote what B'Tselem, the Israeli Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, has to say, what Piketty, the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel, has to say, what Physicians for Human Rights in Israel has to say. I juxtapose the two, and I show that in each and every one of his claims, from the first to the last, he's completely falsified what the documentary record shows. Again, you have to use your judgment. And that means if this issue is important enough to you, and we all have 1,000 things in our life, but if it's important enough to you, you sit down, read the book, juxtapose what I say or the citations I use against Dershowitz's, and decide for yourself. But bear in mind, there's one very big difference between Professor Dershowitz and myself. Well, many, but one that's germane here this evening. The big difference was I have complete faith in the reasoning faculty of ordinary human beings. We're not talking about particle physics here. We're not talking about rocket science. Most ordinary people having the abilities of Cartesian logic, elementary reasoning, and evidence can judge for themselves. So I proceeded to write a book. The big difference between Professor Dershowitz and myself is I did not try to suppress his publication. I'm not afraid of the truth. I'm happy to throw my book out there and let people decide for themselves. It was Professor Dershowitz who mounted a campaign threatening, in his words, he said, if University of California Press publishes his book, I'm quoting him now, I will own that publishing house. He then went as far as the Terminator. He went to Arnold Schwarzenegger, the governor of California, to try to block publication of the book. And to the credit of Governor Schwarzenegger, he formally replied that this was a freedom of speech issue and academic freedom, and he wasn't going to intervene. Whether Schwarzenegger knew what he was talking about, I don't know, but it was still a victory. I'm not afraid to test my claim against what the record shows. And I might add, my publishing house was very cautious. My book went through 9 outside readers and 5 libel lawyers because they were very fearful of Professor Dershowitz's libel threats. Not because they thought they would lose the case, that wasn't the problem, The problem is with most libel cases, they're never settled in court. They're settled out of court, and they're very expensive. And so my publisher said, if Professor Dershowitz sues us in New York, they're in California, they said, we don't even have enough money to fly our staff out to New York. You know, it's a university publishing house. I now have to I have to throw the ball in your court and say, you read the book, you look at the evidence, and to do what I think is the right thing to do. The right thing to do is not to believe me. I don't believe in that. You shouldn't believe me. I always liked the credo that Karl Marx, he was once asked, what's the credo you live by? And he said, de omnibus dubitandum, to doubt everything. And I grew up in a generation where a lot of people like to wear this black button with the words, 2 words, question authority. And I think that's a wise way to conduct one's life. So you shouldn't believe the New York Times, you shouldn't believe Dershowitz, and I'm telling you, coming straight from me, don't believe me. Use your own brain. Go, read the sources, and decide for yourself.
Hi, Professor. I missed part of your speech, so I don't know how much I disagree and how much I agree, but just to give you a background, I'm a Jewish Zionist, and at the same time, I don't feel that the issue needs to be as polarized as you experience it, people like Dershowitz and perhaps yourself, in that a lot of what you say I very much agree with. And if we're looking at where I think there is an area of cognitive dissonance for me, and my question really is it an area for you as well, has to do with, not with the two-state solution, because most Jews in the United States and Israel are for that, or even the boundaries. It has to do with the right of return for Palestinians. And obviously the cognitive dissonance is that there is grave injustice that I can see, and a lot of people can see, in expelling the Palestinians. At the same time, we imagine what it would be like were Israel to open the gates and have a tremendous influx of non-Jews. It would eventually become a non-Jewish state. There's my cognitive dissonance, and I would ask of you, because you were presenting it as this is all a very simple situation, but I wondered if you had cognitive dissonance on any of this as well.
Well, first of all, people in the audience may disagree with me, and I'm not out to win a popularity contest. I want to settle the conflict. And settling the conflict means trying to honestly deal with these questions. I think that's a reasonable question. I'm not sure if I would use a fancy term like cognitive dissonance, I tried to steer away from this terminology which tries to make this conflict sound more complicated than it is. It is a difficult question. One has to make a distinction, however, in my opinion, between what is your legal right and then how do you resolve the question practically. What does that mean for our purposes? If you allow me a small illustration, I'm not comparing, please bear in mind, I'm not comparing magnitudes of suffering. I'm trying to simply illustrate a point. Magnitudes of suffering, there's no comparison, obviously. As you know, I was denied tenure at DePaul. DePaul's case was not very strong. In fact, DePaul's case was preposterous. And my lawyer said, I had a wonderful lawyer who's a close friend of mine, Lynn Bernabe, and she said, Norman, if you go to court, you can win the case, and you'll win your right of return to DePaul. She said, that's an open and shut case. DePaul acknowledged you were an excellent teacher and scholar. How can they deny you tenure? But she said, Norm, do you really want to spend the next 6 years in court? because that's how long tenure cases usually take. By the time I got tenure, I'd be already too late. I'm not a spring chicken anymore. And it would also mean consuming valuable time for me. And I'd rather work on my political commitments than on this academic freedom issue, because I never believed in academic freedom. I just think it's nonsense. It's a myth. So she said, okay, if you don't want to go to court, and she said, I agree with you, then we have to aim for a settlement. And we got a settlement. And the settlement had to have two components. Number one, our settlement had to have a public recognition by DePaul that had committed an injustice against me. It dragged me through the mud the last year, maligned my name, slandered me, character assassinated me. They had to acknowledge, no, Professor Finkelstein was an outstanding professor at this school. And they did. The statement said, we acknowledge Professor Finkelstein was an outstanding teacher and a prolific scholar. And then the second component was a financial component to the settlement. Now, I never gave up my right to return. I still think I had the right. But all things considered, I was willing to reach a settlement, which I thought under the circumstances was reasonable. And I say the same principle with the Palestinians. They have the right. It is incontestable. I can tell you from personal knowledge. As I said earlier, Human Rights Watch is a conservative organization. And when the issue of the right of return came up, a member of the board of directors for the first time hired a private lawyer to try to prove the Palestinians didn't have a right of return. And it created a huge schism in the organization. But at the end of the day, they researched a dozen other examples of refugee generation in the war, and they said there can't be any question. The Palestinians have the right to return. So we can't contest that right. Acknowledge the right, and then if you think that it's unfeasible, you believe, then you have to make the Palestinians an offer which they're willing to accept. Nobody has the right to tell the Palestinians they have no right. If you think that Israel can't meet that demand, then you have to make an offer to them, a settlement offer, which just like myself, they're willing to accept. But what I will not accept is anybody telling the Palestinians as a precondition for negotiations that they have to give up the right. That's their right. At one of the schools where I taught at Brooklyn College when I was fired in 1992, some students were upset and they went to one of the radical professors on campus and said, don't you think you should fight for Norman's right to stay? And he said, well, I think Finkelstein would be happier elsewhere. And I thought to myself, hey, I thought I was supposed to be the one to decide that. We have no right to tell other people what to do with their rights. Our responsibility is to support their rights. And then if somebody thinks, the other side thinks it can't work, okay, make them an offer. And I can't say I'm fully cognizant of the Arab or the Palestinian mind, whatever that means. But my experience has been Palestinians are perfectly reasonable. Make a reasonable offer, and let's see what happens. But let's just be clear. The Israeli position now is a non-starter. The official Israeli position is, to quote Ehud Barak in Camp David, we will not accept any moral, legal, or historical responsibility for what happened to the Palestinians. That's like DePaul refusing to acknowledge what happened to me. No, that's a non-starter. I can tell you from personal experience, I'm not allowed to discuss the terms of my settlement. But had DePaul not issued that statement, we're going to court. Yes, I want my dignity restored. I want my humanity restored. And the Palestinians have that right as well. You can't tell them they had no historical right to be in the country where they were born and where all of their ancestors were born. And now you're going to come along and say they had no right to be there? No, you're not. Be reasonable. Be reasonable. Be respectful of other people's feelings and sufferings. My closest friend in the occupied territories and one of my closest friends for life, Musa Abu Heshesh. He's the Hebron field representative for B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories. And he grew up in Fawar camp. And he said to me, you know, Norm, I'm conservative on the refugee question. And he took me to the room where his family grew up. The room is about, a little bigger than this podium. And no, he's not going to accept that you're simply going to abolish the whole history and pretend it didn't happen. Well, that's a non-starter. Be reasonable. Respect other people's dignity. Respect their suffering. And I'm fully confident that you can achieve a settlement with the Palestinians, but not on the terms that Israel is now presenting. Namely, we don't even begin negotiations until the Palestinians give up their rights. No, they don't. Nobody has to give up their rights. And nobody has the right to tell them to give up their rights. Our responsibility is to defend their rights and then see what happens.
Mr. Finkelstein, in 1948, the UN approved the partition of the State of Israel into a Jewish state and an Arab state. Jordan to the west and Egypt to the south had both previously been created and attacked first upon the creation of the State of Israel. Egypt and Jordan had the opportunity between 1948 and 1967 to create a Palestinian state. Why was there not the same response when the region was under Jordanian and Egyptian control?
Mm-hmm. I want to just say, young men, I'm not in any way trying to be insulting. I'm way past that. I want to end the conflict, and I want to be reasonable. But it does trouble me, and I want you to think about it. You come here with canned questions. I gave a lecture, I spoke for around an hour, and there was a large amount of material in what I had to say. You don't even listen. You just come in here with a prepared question that has nothing whatsoever to do with what I was speaking about. It's as if I were giving a lecture on particle physics and you were coming here and talking about botany. You don't even listen. You really have to, in my opinion, open your mind and listen. You're not looking at an enemy here. And you shouldn't come in my opinion, you shouldn't come in with these canned questions which Hillel gives you or some other organization to prepare you. Listen and think for yourself. And then I think we can make some progress. Think for yourself, where was I unreasonable? What statement of mine was factually untrue? What did I misrepresent? How did I try to pull the wool over the eyes of the audience? I could sit down here now and speak to you at great length about what happened in 1947 and thereafter. But I didn't provide any background material to give an answer to a question like that. I didn't lecture on the topic. It's absolutely meaningless now for me to answer that question. Most people in the room don't even know what you're referring to. I don't understand how you engage in a dialogue that way. Do you want me to start telling you that in 1947 Israel had already struck a deal with Jordan to absorb the West Bank? Do you want me to tell you that Egypt never annexed Gaza, Egypt never annexed Gaza, that between 1947 and 1967, the position of the Arab world was still to restore the rights of the Palestinians to the whole of Palestine? After 1967, when that became an unrealistic demand, the Arab leagues, or the Arab countries, beginning in the early 1970s, then in concert with the entire international community, came to accept the two-state settlement. And that's the genesis of what we have now today. I could go through the whole history. With all due respect, from well before you were born, I was reading about it. And the number of books I read, sometimes I think could fill this whole room. It's actually rather depressing. The world is a very big place, and my entire adult life was devoted to learning about one tiny corner of it. But I don't see the purpose of doing that now. First of all, I doubt you even know the scholarly literature on the topic. It's easy for me to make rings around you. I can cite 1,000 different resources. I can make you look foolish. I don't see the point of it. Why don't you listen to what I have to say and answer?
With all due respect, it is a very pertinent question.
I'm not sure why is it pertinent. Explain to me why it's pertinent.
Since 1967, the world has been on a constant onslaught against Israel, stating that they must give back the 1947 creation of the state of Palestine. Fine. However, in 1947, when the original partition plan had been approved, there was just as much an opportunity to create a second state in the region. Why was there no pressure at that point to follow through with what the 1947 partition stated?
Well, I told you why. Up until from between 1947 and 67, the Arab states did not accept the legitimacy of the state of Israel. And now that, as it were, progress has been made, it seems you want to turn the clock back to when they didn't accept. I acknowledge progress has been made. The Arab world, all 22 members of the Arab League, have agreed. Now, are you upset by that fact? Would you rather they deny Israel's existence? Would you rather they call for the elimination of the state of Israel? Do you prefer that? I don't understand why. If you're truly interested in resolving the conflict, not looking for pretexts, not looking for excuses, not looking for alibis, it seems to me you would welcome a change of heart, and a change of heart which has now endured for nearly 30 years. That would seem for those who seek a diplomatic settlement, that would seem to me grounds for rejoicing. But if you don't want a diplomatic settlement, if you're looking for all sorts of excuses because you want to steal other people's land, because you want to control their lives, because you want to render their lives so intolerable and so unbearable that they'll finally pack up and leave and go wherever they can. If that's your goal, then yes, more than anything else in the world, you're going to dread the record I've just gone over, because that record is your big problem. The problem is, for whatever reason, the Arab world, the Palestinians, have expressed a willingness to accept the international consensus and resolve the conflict. And unfortunately, that's what Israel dreads, and that's apparently what you dread, because you don't want to talk about the last 30 years. You want to go back. I could go back too. I can go back and say, well, Israel's top historian now, Benny Morris, he says, quote, that expulsion, what he calls transfer, was built into Zionism. It was built in, it was inevitable. And then he goes and says that the chief motor of Arab resistance to Zionism was the fear of territorial dispossession and territorial dislocation. Well, I ask you, why should the Palestinians have accepted a movement which, according to Israel's leading historian now, built into it was their expulsion? He says it was inbuilt into Zionism. It was inevitable. It seems to me then the Palestinian position was perfectly reasonable. Does anyone think any country has, any people, has the responsibility to commit politicide? And they resisted. Why? Exactly what Mara said. The fear of territorial expulsion, territorial dispossession. That seems to me reasonable. And the Palestinian position was completely reasonable. But time has passed, and now there's a formula available. You have to ask yourself the question, why do Israelis and the Israeli government and their alleged supporters, why do they dread that record so much? Why is it I'm talking about 1967 to the present, and you don't want to hear from it? You want to go back to 48. You don't want to hear that the other side is willing to settle. Why don't you want to hear that? I don't understand that, unless you don't want a settlement, a negotiated settlement. And then the only alternative is to annihilate them. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I think you were next. Sorry.
Yeah, and Israeli historian has said that the Israeli state was modeled after the Israeli state and society was modeled after America's pioneers. Now, he meant that in a benign way, but in your opinion, what do you think, is it part of a manifest destiny that, Israel is a illegal settler colonial state, and we know America is not going to give back the land to its indigenous people? And now, the whole critique of what he wrote was that America sees Israel, the state of Israel, in its own eyes as being some sort of, people being dispossessed, and architects of Zionism, Herzl and so forth, people going to a land because they've been oppressed, and these programs and whatnot. Now, do you see, it's a long question, do you see Israel, the legal state of Israel, in a two-party state nation living side by side with people they despise, who Obama's chief of staff, who I think has dual citizenship, father was in a terrorist, I forget, gang or whatever it was? Do you actually believe, and I'm not opposed to what you're saying, but realistically, do you see them ever living side by side, peacefully, harmoniously, egalitarianly, with people they despise as the American settlers despised the indigenous people and looked at them as savages? And one more question, it's in the same line. Obama recently, during his campaign, went to AIPAC, promised $30 billion to the Anti-Zionist Political Action Committee, $30 billion to the state of Israel over 10 years. Now, Biden wrote a thing called a Greater Zion. I don't know if it ever passed, basically where Israel would control the whole so-called Middle East. Hold on, I'm getting to it. I don't got the mic. Now, my question is, do you really realistically believe that the legal state of Israel will live peacefully side by side, and with America will allow that? And what does America and Israel, the state of Israel, have with Iraq? What are their roles with Iraq, and what role does Israel, the legal state of Israel, play in that?
Okay. Actually, I happen to think those are legitimate and important questions. On the first question, namely, can I actually conceive them living side by side, as you said, in an egalitarian fashion, mutual respect, and so forth? Right, excuse me? Okay. There are two aspects. So I'll just speak now as an American, American in our own history. There was once a point when Martin Luther King was agitating sit-downs, sit-ins, civil disobedience, and somebody said to him, you know, you keep this up, you're going to alienate all these white people. And how do you expect to get along with them and live with them in peace when you're constantly creating all of this ruckus and creating all of this mayhem? And he replied that, he said, you'll never get white people to love you that way, it was said to him. And he replied that, first I want white people to stop lynching me, and then I'll worry about them loving me. And that seems to me, yeah, allow me just, that seems to me the right sequence. The first thing is to resolve this problem of the occupation, to restore the legal rights of the Palestinians and to end Israel's illegalities, its gross violations and criminal acts, many criminal acts in the occupied territories. Once we've solved the legal question, then we move on to the question of love. And I think it's fair to say, you might want to disagree, but I think it's fair to say, okay, white people and black people in the United States don't love each other, but there have been, in a relatively short historical period, say 50 years, in terms of interpersonal relations, leaving aside the legal questions, there have been improvements in the United States. You have to acknowledge, however cynical you are about the Barack Obama impending presidency, and nobody is more cynical than I am on that score, it nonetheless has to be acknowledged that it's a tremendous testament and tribute to the American people. When you consider what the United States was like 50 years ago, that they could see it in themselves to vote for an African American as president. Things change. When Rodney King, after the LA riots, he famously said, "Why can't we all get along?" When I first heard that line, I thought, my God, talk about insipid lines. This is like Dorothy in Oz or Kansas. But then after I thought about it, I thought that was like really the right line. Can't we all get along? And I think the answer is, I retain the faith, I preserve the hope. We can all get along. But I agree with you. It's got to be get along on mutual respect, mutual honoring of each other's human dignity. Anything else, in my book, is unacceptable. And it's a struggle. It's a struggle to get the other side to recognize you, not just in a patronizing way, not just in a condescending way, and not just in the way of a liberal philanthropist, but as an equal who has something equally to contribute to this world. It's a struggle, but I think it's possible. And I think our own experience here should tell us it's possible. And I also agree with you, however, that if Israel continues to carry on as it does, a murdering and marauder state, which treats the Arabs like fish in a barrel, that goes on these expeditions periodically in places like Lebanon, and every time the Lebanese people build up their country after another onslaught from those vandals and marauders, Israel goes in again and levels the country. When you have pathological creatures like the current leaders of the state of Israel, who now refer to what they call the Dahiyya concept. Dahiyya refers to the part of Beirut, South Beirut, where it was in the last war completely leveled. It's a moonscape. That's where the Shia lived, the Hezbollah supporters. It was simply leveled. I was in Dahiyya less than a year ago. And now these Israeli vandals and marauders, they talk about in the next war, they're going to turn all of Lebanon into Dahia. No, you can't live with people like that. You can't coexist with people like that. These people need to be stopped dead in their tracks. But if they behave respectfully and they honor and respect their neighbors, I'm optimistic you can achieve a settlement. Yeah.
On the question of the one-state solution, I mean, as you eloquently bring out in your books, et cetera, exposing the state of Israel from the very beginning and its establishment of actually forcing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, killing them and forcing them out of that their country. And you made a statement that the one-state solution has no international support. I guess what I would say is, I think the people of the world want to see the end of Israel, just as they want to see the end of U.S. occupation in Iraq, and many people want to see the end of the U.S. state. I would just want to say, I think international support, for example, in Vietnam and the struggle of the Vietnamese people, they got a lot of international support, especially when they actually defeated U.S. imperialism. And I do think if we look at the question of, you can't have any kind of commonality until you get rid of the state of Israel. And then to establish a democratic state.
Look, sir.
That's the question.
With all due respect, I doubt there's anyone in this room who's more sensitive to, cognizant of, and appalled by the crimes of the state of Israel. However, let's maintain our proportions. What Israel does in a year, the United States does in the world in an hour. And so if you want to eliminate states because of the murder, mayhem, and all the other horrors they inflict on the world, let's talk about the United States first. When you want to, when you agree with the destruction and elimination of the American entity, and after that's done, okay, we can move on to Israel. Until then, I think it's very presumptuous of Americans to talk about all the crimes that Israel commits. I mean, go to 9/10 of the world. They're not talking about the crimes of Zionism. They're talking about the crimes of the U.S. government. And yet I myself would say I'm not supporting the destruction of the United States. I wouldn't mind, if we take some of those leaders and do what happened to those folks in Nuremberg. That's why lampposts were created. But the destruction of the United States, forget it. You lost me. Good night.